This lecture covers the sections of a research article. Any research article that you read will basically have these sections. Now, if the article is based on theory, it will not have all of these sections. So this is specific to research articles. Now, to begin with, somewhere on the first page should be the title of the article, and the title should give you a sense of what the article is about. It should also include the author or authors of the paper, as well as their institutional affiliations. Next comes an abstract, which is a brief summary of the article. It's often limited to 200 words, so it will very briefly, maybe in 1 or 2 sentences, summarize the entire paper. And then there are often keywords that clue people in as to some of the key themes in the article. So this will allow people to find the article using search engines. So for example, if a study is on the effectiveness of cognitive behavioral therapy with adolescents, the keywords would be cognitive behavioral therapy and adolescent. And then if you used a search engine and included those terms, this article should pop up. Then on a new page is the introduction to the article. There often is not a heading that says introduction, but it's basically the first section of the paper, and it may have subheadings. It will tell you the purpose of the paper, why this study is important, and it should connect to prior research in the area and provide a rationale for the current study. So why is this study warranted? And it sets the context. What is the previous research on this topic, and how does this study fit with it? Often the lit review is kind of included in the introduction section, but there may be specific headings for the lit review or for subsections within the lit review. So the literature review should cover research specific to this area, and it should include the most recent and relevant studies. It should also define the concepts and variables clearly that are being studied in the current study. And it should also state the research questions and/or hypotheses guiding the study. Now, sometimes these are very explicitly stated. So maybe the authors write, our research question was this, and the hypothesis is this. Other times it's kind of buried in there. It's not as obvious, and you have to kind of dig through the article a little bit to determine what the research question is and what the hypothesis is, if there is one. And hypothesis is going to be present in any kind of explanatory study, but may not be present in an exploratory study. However, there should be a research question guiding any kind of study, exploratory, descriptive, or explanatory, but sometimes the authors don't include it as clearly as they could. Next is typically the methods section, which basically tells you what they measured, how they went about doing it. So the type of study should be specified here. For instance, is it a qualitative study? Is it quantitative? Is it cross-sectional? Is it longitudinal? It should tell you who the population being studied is and how they selected their sample. So if the population is all teenagers diagnosed with depression, they have to tell you how they went about selecting a sample, a subset of this population for the current study. If the authors use standardized instruments, so perhaps the Hamilton Depression Scale or the Beck Cognitive Scale, they should report the validity and reliability of the research instruments. So they should give you a sense of whether or not these are valid and reliable instruments that they are using. It should also cover the research design and procedures that they used. So how did they recruit people into the study? When did they assess them? How did they assess them? How many groups were involved? This all should be clearly stated. It should also cover any methodological issues and sources of bias that pertain to the study. Were there any problems in collecting the data that should be mentioned? And are there any sources of bias related to the researchers or related to the data that should be stated? And basically, the methods section should be detailed enough that you can assess, is this a sound research design? are these good research methods for this question? And they should also be detailed enough to allow someone to replicate the study. So if you wanted to go out and conduct the same study all over again, maybe in a different location, did they give you enough detail that you could do that? Next comes the results section, which summarizes the major findings of the article. So basically what is happening here is that the author is presenting an analysis of information that they gathered that helps answer the research question. And you typically move from simple to complex analyses. So for instance, you might start with demographic data. What are the characteristics of the people in the study? What's the breakdown of age, gender, any other factors that are relevant to the study? It would also include some descriptive statistics, which are just figures that describe the sample or describe the data. And this can often be covered in the demographic data, but it may also include what percentage of participants completed the different instruments. Next would move to some of the more complex statistical tests, if any were run, and there should be a rationale for their use. So the reader should be assured that these tests were appropriate for the data. And so you might move from using a relatively simple test like a t-test to using a regression analysis, which is more complex. So the tests are typically presented in order of the most simple to the most complex, along with a justification for every test that is presented. Tables and graphs are often included in both quantitative and qualitative research studies. Graphs maybe not so much in qualitative studies, but there can be a table summarizing some of the major themes in a qualitative analysis, or a table showing maybe the demographic and statistics and descriptive statistics in a quantitative study. In a qualitative study, there will typically be samples of the data. So perhaps you conducted interviews with teenagers diagnosed with depression. You would include some excerpts of what the people you interviewed said, so in their own words, direct quotations. And it's important to note that in the results section, you're only reporting the findings. This is not the place to interpret them or talk about what they may mean. That is saved for the discussion section, which is really when you take your results, you summarize the major findings, and then you interpret them. So you talk about what this means, what the implications of your findings are. And you will often draw on the relationship to previous research. So maybe you found similar results to what similar studies have reported, then you could talk about how your results kind of strengthen the confidence that these results overall are accurate. Or perhaps you found something very different from what previous research has found. Then you would want to talk about why that might be and suggest some possibilities for that. You should also tie the findings to the implications for social work practice. So great, you have this nice research study that yields some research findings. How do these translate into social work practice? And you may comment on the need for further research in this area, what other avenues could be explored that maybe weren't explored in this study. And so the limitations of the project should always be addressed. Maybe the results aren't going to generalize to people beyond those in the sample, so that should be noted. Any design weaknesses should be noted, so maybe it involved an intervention group and a comparison group, but there was no randomization. That should be noted. And you can also discuss questions that weren't answered by the research that perhaps could be addressed in future research. And then somewhere in the paper, there should be attention to some ethical considerations. So if the study was funded, the funding source needs to be acknowledged and any values made explicit. Any potential bias or conflict of interest should be acknowledged. So if a researcher is also an employee at an agency being studied, that should be acknowledged. The study should be reviewed by an institutional review board, and it should say somewhere in the article that it was reviewed and approved by an IRB or by some other body that has oversight capacity. And then throughout the paper, the language should be free of bias, stereotypes, and other cultural insensitivities. I should note also that there's sometimes a conclusion section to a paper that is clearly marked as a conclusion, but sometimes it's kind of folded into the discussion section. And then there won't be a heading typically for ethical considerations, but these are kind of worked in throughout the paper. Lastly is a list of references that should be in APA format. Now, all sources cited in the paper must appear in the reference list, and all entries in the reference list must be cited in the paper. You shouldn't have something in one place but not the other. And here's an example of a reference in APA format. You can see that you use just the last name, comma, and then the first initial, or the first two initials if they're given, and then a period, and then the year, and then another period. And then the title of the article, only the first word is capitalized, Getting to Adulthood. But then there's a colon and a subtitle, Foster Youth at the Crossroads, so the F in foster care is also capitalized. That's the name of the article. Next is the name of the journal that the article was published in. So for instance, Social Work Research. And then a comma that was missing that I just added. And then is the volume number of the journal, also in italics, 62. And then in parentheses, the issue number, if there is one, in this case 3, which is not in italics. So the name of the journal is in all caps, Social Work Research, and in italics, and then the number, the volume number. Then the issue number is not in italics, and it's in those parentheses, and then there's a comma, and then there is the page numbers of where the article falls in the journal. So in this case, pages 711 through 730, and then it ends with a period. Now if there are multiple authors, you would say, for example, Randall, comma, P, period, comma, and then the same format for each additional author using an ampersand between the last two authors. APA format is really important to understand as a social work student, and you will be expected to be able to identify APA format and to put your own references into APA format. So please pay attention to the format here. You can also use the APA Style Guide or an online website like the Purdue OWL that provides a nice resource for writing in APA format.